Welcome to the motherfucking We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. WBC President Mauricio Suleiman has said it's his understanding that the Terence Crawford versus Errol Spence rematch will not be happening next, and they are now giving Crawford's team time to figure out his next move. A lot of time has gone into speculating, postulating, what will Terence Crawford do now that the rematch isn't happening? Boxing insider Rick Glacier said that now that Spence took the smart way out, avoiding a Crawford rematch, whose head is Terence Crawford's fists going to land on next? It could well be WBO World Junior Middleweight Champion Tim Kazoo. Crawford chooses to fight next. If Crawford wants Zoo, WBO, per their rules, will name Crawford the junior middleweight division's #1 contender, basically forcing Zoo into the fight. That would be a very big fight with worldwide interest, which we've talked about already. Most of the focus is centered around what Terence Crawford is going to do next and not Errol Spence Jr. because to a lot of people, Errol Spence Jr. is finished. After just one loss? There are so many who try every day to diminish Terence Crawford's lopsided victory over Errol Spence Jr., saying that the car accident messed him up, that he was damaged goods and it changed him, and yet the car accident didn't stop him from beating Danny Garcia. A year after it happened, it didn't stop him from beating Danny. It didn't stop him from beating Ugas. It didn't stop many of you from picking him to win. So spare me a bit about the car accident. He was good enough to beat Danny, he was good enough to beat Ugas, and he was good enough that many of you bozos actually thought he was going to beat Terence. Now, I've been picking Terence to beat Errol since before the car accident. If you've been following this channel long enough, you'll know that. You'll know I've been picking Terence to win that fight since before the car accident. For 5 years straight. You know why? Because Errol wasn't ever on Terence's level. Before the car accident, after the car accident, he was never as good as Terence. Ever. You want to tell me the car accident messed him up? You want to tell me that he was what? That he was weight drained? That's what some people are saying, that he was weight drained. Even though Derek James, Errol's own trainer, said weight had nothing to do with it. Derek said that. Fight was at welterweight. Right there at welterweight. His last fight was at welterweight. The Ugas fight. Fight before that, he made the weight just fine. He made the weight. You want to tell me he's weight drained? I'd say that Kell Brook was more weight drained when he came down to fight Errol than Errol was when he fought Terence. But talking about weight and being weight drained. Because Kell Brook actually came down in weight. He came down in weight to fight Errol Spence Jr. If your excuse is going to be that Errol was weight drained when he fought Terence Crawford, I can turn around and say the same thing about Kell Brook when he fought Errol. It's more valid. Kell Brook went up in weight. He went up to middleweight to take on Gennady Golovkin and got stopped in 5 rounds, remember? Before he fought Errol. Suffered a fractured orbital bone, had to get surgery on it. Before he fought Errol. From 160 all the way back down to 147 that he was already struggling to make. Before he fought Errol. So if what you're going to tell me now is that Terence only beat Errol because Errol was weight drained for making a weight he was already making, that's got to also apply to Kell Brook because he actually moved up in weight and had to come back down. Where Errol didn't move anywhere. You want to bring up the cataracts? That he had cataracts? Kell Brook had a fractured orbital bone. What's worse? Had a fractured orbital bone from the Golovkin fight that he had to have surgery on right before he fought Errol Spence Jr. You want to say that Errol was out too long. Whose fault is that? After talks between Terence and Errol collapsed in late 2022, Terence made sure to have a tune-up fight, a keep busy fight, couldn't Errol? I thought Errol was the A-side. If Terence, who was a network and promotional free agent with no major promoter behind him, could find the time to have a maintenance fight, a keep busy fight, then why couldn't Errol? Didn't Errol have the whole PBC and Showtime behind him? If he didn't have a tune-up fight like Terence did, that's his own fault. Just like flipping that Ferrari. That's his own fault. In Errol's own words, he wasn't living like a fighter. Now you tell me whose responsibility is that? Is it Terence's responsibility that Errol take care of his own body? That Errol live like a fighter? That Errol show some discipline? Whose responsibility is that? You know that's just as much a part of a fighter's eliticism as anything else, right? I mean, you know that. You understand that a part of being an elite level athlete is taking care of yourself, is having that discipline to stay away from certain habits. You guys were watching Errol palling around with Adrian Broner and Robert Easter, I believe it was, drunk out of his mind. And this is before the car accident. He got on the podium and said that he was the A-side to Terence Crawford and Terence had to come across the street. That was before the car accident. He was drunk then. But there are those out there, a small minority, a minority of a few, who would have you believe that it was Terence Crawford waiting Errol Spence Jr. out, even though Terrence is older than Errol.
How's that work?
How can he age a guy out when he's older than that guy? How does that work?
It's not the age, it's the weight they're saying.
No, we're back on the weight. We're back to weight. Well, Derek James said the weight wasn't a problem.
That's what he said.
And if we're going to use weight as an excuse for Errol, then certainly it has to be an excuse for Kell Brook. It would have to be, because ahead of the Errol Spence Jr. fight, he was coming down from middleweight, whereas ahead of the Terrence Crawford fight, Errol was right there at welterweight. He was there before, he was there after. He didn't go nowhere. If you're going to use weight as an excuse to diminish Terrence's victory over Errol, I can use it as an excuse to diminish Errol's victory over Kell.
Two-way street.
Do you see how ridiculous all of these excuses are? This hierarchy of thought, not dissimilar from what you saw from Deontay Wilder when he lost, and what excuses he was making, and what excuses his fans were making for him. And what do those two guys have in common?
They're both PBC fighters.
They're both PBC fighters. They're both PBC hype jobs.
Both of them.
And now what they want is for Jaron Boots Ennis to get Errol Spence Jr.'s leg back for him. But when Jaron Ennis eats, Errol Spence don't shit.
He can't get Errol's leg back for him.
Can't fix it for him. He can't save face for Errol. No, you're just propping him up so he can save face for you. You, that picked Errol, that talked all that fucking shit.
And now they're making excuses for Boots.
Making excuses for him because before Terrence Crawford laid a glove on Errol Spence Jr., who did he reach out to?
He reached out to Boots. He tried to fight Boots, and Boots and Bozy were more focused on being loyal to Showtime. Showtime, who is now out of boxing.
Real smart those two guys are. What happens to Errol now? I don't know, because I don't think he has that much more to give to the sport of boxing, and I never really liked his chances north of welterweight. He might have been a decent-sized guy at welter, bigger guy at welter, not so big at junior middle or middle.
In his own words, he wasn't living like a fighter. Wasn't living like a fighter. That doesn't sound like a dedicated fighter to me.
Terrence Crawford goes in there, beats him half to death, and what, he's gonna be dedicated now? Wouldn't trust this guy to beat Tim Tszyu, let alone Terrence Crawford in a rematch. The saving grace is there ain't gonna be one. There ain't gonna be no rematch.
But I don't think that means Errol can resurrect his career, because who can he beat up there? Who can he beat at 154? Who can he beat at 160?
And when are they gonna get him back out? The last time he was in action was late July of last year. Is it gonna be a year before he sees action again? That's not good.
Neither is the offering from the PBC.
They got less fight dates now. Less than what they had on Showtime. It's less opportunities to get Errol Spence Jr. back out there, isn't it?
Should they let him back out there?
It's not just losing. It's not just losing to Terrence Crawford. That lacks context. It's everything.
But he's focused on what Crawford's gonna do moving forward. What is Errol gonna do moving forward?
It's the better question. Men's cruiserweight news. Former WBO cruiserweight champion Lawrence Okolie eyes a move up in weight for shackles off title comeback.
What happened to his rematch clause?
That's what I told you. You can have a rematch clause and you can go as far as activating it, but if the fight is not financially viable to the promoter, if the promoter looks at the fight as a wash,
Might decide not to do it. The rematch may not happen, and this one isn't happening. The rematch between Lawrence and Chris Smith.
Lawrence hasn't boxed since that contest, but potentially could still return in a world title fight. I think we're going to look to move up to heavyweight or fight immediately for a world title at Bridgerweight. Boxers Ben Shalom told Sky Sports after an unconvincing outing against David Light and then defeat to Chris Smith, a move up in weight could be just what Okolie needs, suggests Shalom.
Shalom.
Is he the face of boxing yet? The face of Sky Sports boxing? The face of Boxer? Because those were the promises made to him that left him so inclined to leave Matchroom for Boxer.
Wants to go up to Bridgerweight.
What is Bridgerweight, you ask? Bridgerweight is a new weight division created by the WBC between cruiserweight and heavyweight at 224 pounds, named after Bridger Walker, who saved his sister in a dog attack. Poland's Lukas Rozensky is their reigning Bridgerweight world champion, and the WBA have so decided to follow suit. They have a Bridgerweight title of their own they have manufactured. The reason for his performances haven't been at the level he was used to. I do think it's the weight. As a 6'6" guy, this is a personal opinion, and especially at that top level, that was getting in the way of his very best performances, the promoter explained. He thinks Lawrence was drained. That's what Ben is saying.
Now he either wants to shoot for a title at Bridgerweight or go all the way up and make the plunge to heavyweight. He's got the dimensions for it.
I think he's looking very seriously at the heavyweight division, possibly Bridgerweight first, And I think that's where we're going to see Lawrence in the latter stages of his career.
Jesus Christ, 2 fights into the deal with Boxer. They're already looking at the latter stages of his career.
He's a really talented fighter, and so I just think the story hasn't even begun for Lawrence Okolie. Cast your mind back to cruiserweights Alexander Usyk and David Haye, and people that have really made their legacy in the heavyweight division. He's a lot bigger than those guys. His frame's a lot bigger. He's had to work extremely hard to do what he's done in the cruiserweight division, and sometimes fighters don't talk about the struggles they go through. The Lawrence Okolie story is just about to begin, and I think it's going to be at a weight division that suits where he's at.
I don't wish ill on Lawrence Okolie,
But there's no nice way for me to say that migrating from Matchroom over to Boxer has had an adverse effect on his career. He lost a lot of time on that. If there's a payola, if there's a payoff, it hasn't paid off yet. And if they think that going to Bridgerweight,
if you think that's going to resurrect his career or that'll make him a star because he picks up a title in a barren division that was just made.
I hate to burst your bubble, but it's not going to work. It's not going to happen. There are no money fights, no high-profile fights at Bridgerweight for Lawrence Okolie. And it's not just picking up a belt, and that'll make you a star. It's also about who you're fighting. Who is there to fight at Bridgerweight or Super Cruiserweight, as the WBA calls it?
I don't know what sounds dumber.
Whatever people may say about his last couple of performances, he's a big name, he's a big personality, he's a big talent.
This has all been a big bust.
There are not a lot of big names in British boxing that are still coming through. That's why the world is at its feet. I know that might be hard to see when you lose your world title, but when you're performing, not at your best, and you're working that hard to make the weight, you might look back and say, you know what? It was a blessing in disguise. He can really let the shackles off and go again.
Ben's not going to tell you what it is because it reflects poorly on him. What it really is that even though Lawrence had a rematch clause, and I think he activated it, the fight between him and Chris Billam-Smith, it's not financially viable. And the worst thing that could happen for Boxer is Lawrence getting that title back.
Chris Billam-Smith sells more tickets than Lawrence Okolie does. He's more popular. So the worst thing that could happen is you do that rematch and Lawrence wins the belt back.
They didn't want to do that rematch.
You know that they didn't because they actually allowed Chris Billam-Smith to fight a voluntary in Matthias Masternak. That wasn't his mandatory, that was a voluntary. For that, you could have voluntarily defended the title against Lawrence.
They didn't want to do that rematch.
Because of what I told you. Now, instead of running it back with Lawrence Okolie, he's running it back with Richard Riakporhe, who beat him 2 or 3 years ago. He's having that rematch and not this one.
Richard Riakporhe's got a more fan-friendly style. He's an easier fighter to sell, and he's more charismatic.
Chris losing the title to Richard isn't bad, but Chris losing it to Lawrence.
I get it.
So they want to send him up to that barren division, that newly formed weight class, Bridgerweight, where he stands a very good chance of becoming a champion, though not a big draw, because there's no money fights up there. There are no high-profile fights at Bridgerweight.
But go ahead.
If that's what you want to do. Just in keeping with the theme of all things Sky Sports and Boxer, a first look at the upcoming Fabio Wortley versus Frazier Clark undercard. You guys will already know that I'm a big fan of Wortley versus Clark as a fight and as a main event. It's intriguing, it's exciting, it's a battle of the unbeatens.
Fabio Wortley is a fighter who is making the most of his free agency so to speak. His last fight,
The fight against then unbeaten David Adelaide, that was a Queensbury Promotions show. In the past, Fabio Wortley has boxed on Matchroom shows. He boxed on a Queensbury show.
in his last fight, and he's boxing in a Boxer show on Sky Sports in his next fight. I like it.
And I've talked about that during live streams. I've talked about Wortley versus Clark. What has my attention here is the undercard, what we see on the undercard. The battle between Alen Babic and Steven Robinson.
USSR Robinson, a fighter who bears a striking resemblance to Dolph Lundgren in Rocky IV fame.
Against Alen the Savage Babic, yet another fighter that you used to see on Matchroom shows, on Matchroom undercards, but that relationship, whatever it was, it seems to have ended, having suffered his first professional loss in Poland to Lukas Rozansky.
But a newly vacated WBC Bridgerweight title that Oscar Rivas vacated.
He used to be WBC Bridgerweight champion, and for whatever reason, he vacated the title. Thus, Lukas Rozansky and Alen Babic fought for it. And Alen Babic, he got knocked out, he got stopped. Both he and Steven Robinson are on the bounce. They're both coming off of losses in their last fight. Steven Robinson sports a professional record, 6 wins with 2 losses, no draws, 4 knockouts, having never been knocked out in 8 professional bouts.
What do we need to know about Robinson?
Steven Robinson was one of the first fighters fighting under the Boxer banner after Matchroom and Sky Sports parted ways and Boxer stepped in to fill their shoes. Steven Robinson was one of the first fighters fighting under the banner.
He's lost 2 fights since then.
He's 33 years old. They both are. Both Alen Babic and Steven Robinson are 33 years old.
No discrepancy in age, but there is a discrepancy in the fighter sizes, where Alen Babic is a very modest 6'1". Steven Robinson is about 6'7".
He's a big guy. When I saw the fight was made, I wondered if it would be billed as a cruiserweight or maybe a bridgerweight contest, but I don't actually think Steven, given his physical dimensions, can get down that low.
224?
It's asking a lot. Alen Babic might be able to because he's a more modest size heavyweight. He's barely a heavyweight. His last fight
That was at Bridger.
in April of last year, the night of the fight, it will have been close to a year's time since his last fight.
That was the only fight that he had last year.
The fight with Lukas Rozenski in April of last year. Now he looks to be facing Steve Robinson at the end of March this year, so that's practically a year, give or take. Alen Babic and Fabio Wortley. What do these 2 fighters have in common? What's the common denominator between these 2 guys?
What, that they're both boxing on the same show?
Besides that, the common denominator between Fabio Wortley and Alen Babic is actually Dillian Veit. Dillian Veit, who we haven't seen or heard from since he tested positive for a banned substance ahead of what was supposed to be the Anthony Joshua fight. We haven't seen or heard much from that guy. And seeing 2 of the guys that he's connected to, Alen Babic, Fabio Wortley, boxing on Sky, you get the impression that very soon Dillian Veit might be boxing on Sky.
Think he's gonna leave Matchroom?
Technically, he was never with Matchroom. They had a good working relationship, but they were working with each other on a fight-by-fight basis. He was never actually signed to Matchroom. And I'm not sure, just seeing Fabio and seeing Alen boxing on a Boxer show, it wouldn't surprise me if when Dillian comes back, he does too.
You think the relationship is strained between him and Eddie?
I think that the relationship was never all that great to begin with, and I think that Dillian never liked playing second fiddle to Anthony Joshua, what was and what still is Eddie Hearn's golden goose. He never liked playing second fiddle to that guy.
I'm just bouncing ideas around. I'm just saying that I wouldn't be surprised if Dillian, if and when he comes back on Boxer and not Matchroom.
Wouldn't be surprised back to this fight between Alen Babic and Steve Robinson. They're both on the bounce. They're both coming off of losses. And this is an interesting fight, an intriguing fight. Alen Babic, for all his limitations, he is an entertaining fighter to watch because he's either going to knock the other guy out or get himself knocked out.
Well, he got himself knocked out in his last fight.
There it is. If he wins, he should see about moving back down to Bridgerweight because he doesn't have the physical dimensions for heavyweight. He's too small.
Too raw.
Too crude. Too rough around the edges. Whereas Steven, if he wins, he can stay put. He can stay there. He's got the dimensions for heavyweight.
I like this fight, and we'll talk more about it as the fight date approaches.